What's going on, everybody? Um, really quick. Let's see. Okay. So I know it starts in a couple minutes, but I did want to do kind of a quick little background of where we are at in the fold. So we are in the middle of chapter 2 right now. And in chapter 1, the title of it is The Folds of Matter. Deleuze talks extensively about matter and how he doesn't view it in a Cartesian manner, but rather he views it in terms of folding. And the entire first chapter was about matter, and it was about how you have this Baroque, or this moment, or this operation, I should say, in relation to matter and folding. So when Deleuze talks about the Baroque, like we were talking about last week, he's not talking about necessarily art or architecture or fashion, but he's using the Baroque as a kind of operation for folding. And this process of folding and unfolding is going to be how Deleuze is constructing an immanent metaphysics with Leibniz. So the first chapter was all about matter. The second chapter here is about the soul. It's the folds in the soul, what constitutes a soul, so on and so forth. So he's really trying to get at, as we've been reading, the difference between how can we take something like, a table or a chair, skin, flesh, whatever, and how is all of that not only different from one another, but also different from monads that have a particular level of clarity. So when we talk about the Noah monad that has a particular level of clarity compared to a monad that might be foundational for a rock or something along those lines. Now, we ended with this paragraph and we were kind of confused, and I wanted to sort of discuss it now and answer it before we move on. So it's okay that we're starting a few minutes early. But from this paragraph that I'm sharing, Deleuze discusses a big critique of Leibniz. And in Leibniz's framework, he has to have these two necessary commitments that allows his entire metaphysics to work. The first is that nature is always changing, and change occurs through gradations. So Leibniz is not saying change happens from nothing out of nowhere, but rather change occurs through internal gradations of the monad. So the monad's internal property, internal state is in a state of change. And when all of the monads, the infinite number of them, are all changing at once, they're all changing in harmony with one another. And of course, Leibniz has God to describe that. So the first is continuity. It's that nature's changing, it's infinitely continuous, and it changes via gradations. The second aspect or element of Leibniz's system is about indiscernibility. So that means that no two monads are identical. All monads are individuated, they are distinct from one another. You can't point to one and say that it is the same as another. Now, those are the two necessary commitments for Leibniz, but there is this criticism from Kant, Russell, and Guerreau, which Deleuze isolates, that says Leibniz has to fail, that Leibniz cannot work. And the reason cannot work is that if there are an infinite number of monads and there's no gaps between them, if there are an infinite number of monads and there's no gaps between them, then this causes a kind of problem in their view. Or rather, Deleuze is responding to their critique by talking about continuity and contiguity. So let's talk about why they say that Leibniz fails. They say that Leibniz fails because if nature is truly continuous, meaning all of these monads' properties are internally changing, then you cannot fully differentiate one thing from another thing. It's all just one big blob of things that are constantly changing in a way. So that means that there would be no individuation. That principle of indiscernibility would fail, because if everything's always changing, then you can't point to one thing and another thing and say that they're different, because everything's always changing. And then the second aspect would be, okay, that's fine. Let's grant him maybe things are, you know, maybe things can be distinguished between one another. But then the problem is that would require a gap. So that's why I threw in that photo of the two dots just now. If you look at those two things, sure, you can say that those things are different than one another. One's on the left and one's on the right. One might have a different internal state than another. One of the dots might be gray and one might be black, for example. However, if that's the case, notice that there's a gap between those two dots. So these critics are saying maybe there's a gap between the monads, but then if there's a gap, then nature can't be fully continuous because there's something that needs to fulfill that gap. So the critique of Leibniz, in my opinion, is pretty interesting. It's pretty strong. But the problem that Deleuze finds with this critique is that these critics are confusing two concepts, continuity and contiguity. So for Deleuze, if we make a distinction between those two concepts, then Leibniz can succeed and he doesn't fall or fail at all. And the way that he does that is he says that we shouldn't be looking at each monad as an individual dot. The problem that we normally have when looking at matter and looking at substance, for example, is we kind of start to look at these substances as boxed things, like an atom next to an atom next to an atom, which composes a body or which composes a body. For Deleuze, the monad should not be viewed as an individual box and an infinite number of these boxes next to each other. Instead, monads are a specific perspective of the world. They are not an isolated kind of self-enclosed thing that is separated from another isolated and self-enclosed thing, which is why in this quote he talks about how there is this continuum. So the way that he's trying to talk about this is take a curve and notice that somewhere, on the curve, there's an infinite number of perspectives of what the line or the curve looks like. So it's not that there's a contradiction here. He's just sort of showing that the monad maybe isn't supposed to be viewed like an atom, but it should be viewed more like a perspective. So it's kind of an interesting thing happening with Deleuze's response. Rudyard says contiguity. Yes, exactly, contiguity. And whenever I teach or go over Kant's ethics, I always talk about the contradiction, that if there's a contradiction in the action, then it's unethical. And then Rudd also says, I've always thought of Leibniz as making a sort of atoms for philosophy, tiny Platonic form version of atoms. Right, and that's exactly how many people approach Leibniz. That's what Deleuze is saying is wrong, though, because then we're still stuck in a notion of even matter itself being, this self-enclosed thing separated from another self-enclosed thing. For Deleuze, it's interesting with how he views matter. He views it as infinitely, you can divide it infinitely because it's infinitely folded. But the monad itself, that kind of foundation for reality, so to speak, it's not an infinite number of atoms that matter can now have a foundation for. Instead, it's an infinite number of perspectives of the world. And each perspective encompasses the entirety of the world, but from its own perspective. So it's really fascinating with how he's resolving this kind of critique. And I'm really loving what he's doing there. And here's the good example here, and I'll also post this picture, which you all might find interesting. And for Patina, you'd know this because you've been in this reading for a minute. But when we look at the inflection point right here, you can just Google inflection point. When we look at the inflection point, notice that this is a distinct point on a curve. And the reality is, though, even though it's distinct, it doesn't break the curve. So if we look at a curve, there's no gaps here, yet it still has a distinct place. It has a distinct kind of perspective. So that means that for Deleuze, the singularity or the point can be can be internal to the continuum, but it's not separate from it. So when we're looking at reality as an infinite curve, that's how Deleuze is describing the universe or reality for his metaphysics here. Look at reality as this infinite curvature that's constantly in a state of flux, an infinite number of curves, an infinite number of points on the curve, and you have an infinite number of perspectives from that. So he's kind of trying to show that you can have individuation, you can have a distinct point while also being internal to continuity. It's kind of a beautiful view, in my opinion. And then Patina wrote, a big thing is that the usual association between distinction equals separability gets problematized by Leibniz. He more or less claims that you can make sense of distinctness equals inseparability. Yeah, I think you're totally right, and I think that's how Deleuze is reading Leibniz here. It's that the kind of idea that distinction must mean that one thing is separate from another thing kind of it seems kind of obvious given how at least we're conditioned or how we think about it. It's that, you take this versus that, x versus y, this point versus that point. Boom, they're different. With the monad here, kind of weird because we're dealing with more of a perspective of the world. And yeah, I totally see what you're saying. So that's how Deleuze is resolving this. One other thing I wanted to add is that many of us in the previous readings are not hardcore mathematicians. However, I've been thinking a lot this past week about it, and we don't need to be hardcore mathematicians for this reading. The reality is, I reread some stuff, and Deleuze is not. He's, of course, talking about mathematical concepts. He's talking about inflection points. We're going to see in this next section as we read, he's going to be talking about cones. And of course, he's talking about math. But he's also not, this isn't necessarily his ultimate specialty per se. I mean, people critique even how he even talks about math. Now, I'm not going to say he's not a good mathematician, but what I'll say is he's using these concepts, just like how we just talked about the inflection point in the curve, to explain reality and explain the nature of existence or the world, universe. So we don't need to fully get every mathematical, concept as if we all have studied this. It's just more so using it as a kind of guide or explanation or approach to reading Leibniz. And and that just means that if you know a little bit of math, you probably will have more to say in the discussion. But it also means that if you don't know math, don't be afraid. We are all learning this together as a team. Okay, let's move on to this next paragraph. I will begin. Point of view on a variation now replaces the center of a figure or of a configuration. The most famous example is that of conic sections, where the apex of the cone is the point of view to which one relates the circle, the ellipse, the parabola, the hyperbola, and even the line and the point, as so many variants depending on the incline of the sectioning plane, scenographies. All these figures become so many manners by which a flat projection or plane is folded. And this flat projection is not exactly the circle, which could have such a privilege only in the old conception of perspective, but rather the objectile, which now declines or describes a family of curves, those of the second degree, of which the circle is a part. This objectile, or geometral, is like an unfolding, but the unfold is not the contrary of the fold, any more than the invariant is the contrary of variation. It is an invariant of transformation. It will be designated by an, quote, ambiguous sign, end quote. In effect, it is enveloped in the variation, just as the variation is enveloped in the point of view. It does not exist outside of variation, just as variation does not exist outside of the point of view. This is why, at the base of this new theory of conic sections, Desargues proposed the term involution to name the relation or the law enveloped by a variation. For example, a triangle being supposed to turn around an axis, the dispositions of the points defined on the axis by the projection of three summits and by the prolongation of the three sides. And in this we see footnote 46 and 47. 46 is on the equation with an ambiguous sign that includes the different cases of the conic section. See this text. And he also writes, For 47, see Rene to tone. In this text, Deleuze comments, Ivan Toro's comments on Desargues' notion of involution, not only in respect to Leibniz, but also to Spinoza, by which he proves all the interest that he had for the theory of conic sections. New light is cast on Spinozism and parallelism. See this text, which is forthcoming, which would be kind of interesting to check out that text, because it's, I don't know when he says forthcoming. I'm assuming that means like the next text coming out of at his time or something along those lines. But really cool. I'm already seeing that we're talking about Spinoza's parallelism. And look at chapters 1 and 2 of this book. We're talking about matter and the soul. How are these things relating? If you take the Noah monad, for lack of a better term, how does the Noah monad relate more to what we call Noah's body than something else? What is that relationship? So we're already starting to talk about something akin to Spinoza's parallelism here. Very, very interesting. Now, let's take a look at this paragraph. Wait, I'm just making sure everyone can see my screen. Okay, let's take a look at this paragraph here. Okay? I'm starting to, I'm appreciating the fact that he's bringing in an example of conic sections. I will post a picture here in the chat. Now let's take a look here. What's the point here with the conic sections? Does anyone have any idea about why Deleuze is talking about how you can kind of look at various views of this conic section and come to, I don't know, kind of conclusion or a perspective of it? The way that I am kind of reading this a little bit is that when you take a cone and you cut it, depending on the perspective that you have a completely different figure. So you can get a circle out of it, parabola. Why might that matter here in this particular context with the fold? Are there any thoughts? For me, it's just kind of a question about how he's building on perspective. For me, it's a question about building on perspective. So we can kind of see how maybe in mathematics we're used to, with a kind of Euclidean geometry, we're used to viewing kind of fixed points all the time. That there is this stable infinitesimal in math that we can take, and that's a fixed kind of center in a way. But what we're looking at here is maybe, is it as fixed as we thought? Or is it also a question of perspective? He says all these figures become so many manners by which a flat projection or a plane is folded. So notice we are talking about folding in the process by which we can take that cone and fold it over and over and over again and get kind of different, different perspectives. And Rudyard says, the continual line with no fixed points reminds me of the math behind a Bezier curve. See, I'm not the most familiar, but I will add that for something to look up right now. And I just Googled it here. It says that a Bezier curve is a mathematically defined smooth curve widely used in computer graphics, animation, and vector design. It is entirely controlled by a set of points rather than rigid pixel values. It's kind of an interesting explanation here. And it looks interesting to me. I guess I'll post this maybe here. I'll post this photo right here in the chat. Just found that in a quick Google. Yeah, quick Google search. Pretty cool, Red. And it also reminds me of how in the last section Deleuze was referencing the smooth and striated plateau, or the exact same references he made in that plateau with Guattari. he talks about in this book. So when we're also talking about things like fractals or Sierpinski's sponge or whatever that other it's called the Thomas Kuhn whatever it is, the line. I'll also kind of post that. Or no, not that one. It's more than a line and less than a surface. I'm forgetting exactly what that is, but it kind of might be important to just kind of show. There it is. It's Van Koch's curve. That's what it's called. I don't know why I thought it was scientific revolution. But yeah, there we go. Right here. And then Rudd says, there's a whole section to math about proving tangency and types of curvature that fit this gradient distinction. Totally. I mean, are you saying in this text? Because for me, I mean, it's like all throughout, right? When he's talking about this, different kinds of curvature and whatnot. So another thing I kind of wanted to note is that last week we also did talk about the objectile. So when Deleuze is talking about the objectile, does anyone have an idea of why he's mentioning this? He's talking about that in relation to the quote old conception of perspective. You know, with Deleuze, we're always getting a very similar idea, I feel like, in a lot of his texts, which is we're not necessarily asking the essence of what something is, but rather what something does, how something is produced, how something emerges. So it's kind of what I'm seeing a little bit when he's talking about the objectile here. Unless, I don't know if anyone has any other view there. See, Patina's probably cooking up something. So, remember that the objectile here is never stable, right? It's not fixed in place. And here, what it's reading like is that it's all of the possible forms of the cone. So what's kind of interesting is maybe the objectile here, it's all of the possibilities of what the cone is or can be. So it produces all kinds of curves. When you're looking at that cone, the hyperbola, the parabola, the circle, and Patina writes, Deleuze talked about temporal modulation earlier. So there's a series of objects conditioned by a POV that undergoes variation over time rather than a spatial one. So he's trying to think of objects in terms of duration, like the shifting of a POV. Everything undergoes a different arrangement and how that gets ordered. Yet totally, and I love this comment, Patina, because earlier this week, I was really kind of struggling with his view of distance, and then something kind of clicked for me, and then it went away again, of course, with philosophy. But remember, we were talking about this last week. Take a temperature. For Deleuze and Guattari, temperature is an intensity. If you have 100 degrees, that's not adding 50 and 50, because 50 degrees is cold, 50 degrees is cold. Adding them together, that doesn't make something hot. So every time you divide temperature, it's always going to change. Every time there's a change in degree, there's also a change in this kind of state. So if you look at temperature, that's an example. If you look at speed, that's another example. 100 miles per hour is not 100 miles per hour is not just 50 miles per hour and 50 miles per hour. So every time it's divided or every time it changes, it's also changing in nature. So temperature and speed are examples that Deleuze and Guattari give. I think Rumpel last week also said like pressure, which was kind of an interesting thing that I've kind of chewed on a little bit. But pressure, that also makes sense, right? Or if we also take what Deleuze is saying here, distance. He's also saying that distance is an intensity, to use the language of 1,000 Plateaus. But he's saying the exact same thing, that one distance is not necessarily the sum of two smaller distances. From one perspective it is, in terms of magnitude. If you take a graph and throw two lines on it, you can always compare the distances no matter where the lines are. But then when you traverse a distance, when you take a distance being traversed by a horse, whether a horse is galloping or walking or trotting, you can't just add up a series of steps and then it culminates in a trot or something along those lines. You can't just take two walks and it's a trot. It's always changing in nature. So when we're looking at distance, I think that this is the hardest thing to kind of conceptualize, the hardest thing to understand throughout. It's that distance is also understood in terms of duration for Deleuze. And that's why, Patina, I really like what you said. It appears purely spatial. If you take the classic Euclidean geometry or Zeno's paradox, we shouldn't be able to move at all. Because if you purely spatialize space and it's all of these strict points that in a line, then you should never be able to move at all because then you would have to pass an infinite number of points. Yet movement can exist in terms of duration. Movement can exist in terms of duration. So I kind of maybe was thinking about it earlier this week, like we like to say a mile is a mile no matter what, but walking uphill a mile versus downhill a mile versus in sand versus going down underground, like all of these are completely different experiences, yet, it's still distance. It's kind of something to think about there. The last thing I wanted to bring up here was maybe this point about how folding and unfolding are not contrary to one another. See, but the unfold is not the contrary of the fold. Okay, so why is the unfolding not the opposite of a fold? I mean, let's do some origami. Let's make a paper airplane. You fold it. Well, if I unfolded it, that seems like the opposite, doesn't it? So what's the point that Deleuze is making here about why these are not just mere opposites? And this is a tricky point. But maybe if someone wants to answer, feel free, of course, but maybe think of the crease. So why is an unfold not just the opposite of a fold? It is enveloped in variation. It's actually such a brilliant point to me. And this to me right here, if I were to like star anything from this text right now, it's going to be this, because that seemingly to me is almost kind of answering what someone like Badiou would argue as a critique of Deleuze. So now let's take a sheet of paper and let's fold it in half. Now, we like to think that the unfolding is just kind of a contrary or opposite. So now we unfold it. But notice we're not back to the same state that we were, because now we're dealing with a sheet of paper that has a crease in it. So Deleuze is trying to get at that the unfold is not canceling the fold, because it's expressing the variation that is already contained in it. So it's kind of an interesting point here that he's trying to say that, this invariant of transformation, quote unquote, this where does he call it? Let's see, this law enveloped by a variation. All of this here to me is just super interesting because he's trying to say that there's something that exists within the variation, and it's not like an external force that's impacting it and whatnot. Rudyard writes, "The fold and unfold are not addition and subtraction." Yes, I like that. I like that. Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's purely, and imagine now, imagine that you have all of reality as like a gigantic piece of paper and it's folded an infinite number of times and we're unfolding it an infinite number of times. And each time it's creating a new origami thing. That kind of novelty. Oh, it's a origami dog. Oh, it's an origami star. It's an origami house. So it's kind of an interesting thing here is that going to be true novelty? I'm not sure, but maybe we'll figure it out. Let's keep reading. No one has drawn out the consequences, as well as the presuppositions, of this new theory of conic sections better than Michel Serres. In a world of infinite or variable curvature, which has lost all center, the importance of substituting point of view for the failing center. Oh, hold on. What's happening? Does this sound terrible? It's definitely my fault. Let me start over. In a world of infinite or variable curvature, which has lost all center, the importance of substituting point of view for the failing center. The new optical mode of perception and of geometry in perception, which repudiates tactile notions such as contact and figure in favor of an architecture of vision, the status of the object, which now exists only through its metamorphoses or in the declension of its profiles, perspectivism as the truth of relativity and not the relativity of the true. This is because the point of view is, in each domain of variation, the power of ordering cases, the condition of the manifestation of the true. Thus, the alternating series of conics, starting from the summit of the cone, finite point, infinite line, finite circle, infinite parabola, finite ellipse, infinite hyperbola, or the series of powers of 2 from the summit of an arithmetic triangle, and for every domain the necessity of assigning the point of view, without which one cannot find the truth. That is, one cannot put variation in series or determine the cases. In every domain, Leibniz constructs the table of cases that refers to the point of view as jurisprudence, or the art of judging. Always find the good point of view, or rather the best, without which there would be only disorder or even chaos. When we invoked Henry James, it was with respect to the Leibnizian idea of point of view as the secret of things, as the focus, as cryptography, or even as the determination of the indeterminate by means of ambiguous signs. What, I am telling you, that of which you are also thinking? Do you agree to tell him about it, provided that we know what to expect of it, about her, and that we also agree about who he is and who she is? Question mark. Only a point of view gives us the answers in the cases as in Baroque anamorphosis. Okay, kind of interesting. I'm already noticing like jurisprudence being mentioned. I think we can get back to that in a second. Now, let us take the point here about Michel Serres. So, what is the purpose of bringing in Michel Serres? I feel like this just felt as I was reading it, just like a lot of just like at moments it felt kind of like these random words not making much sense. But obviously, he's bringing in a lot about perspectivism, relativity. Um, what are we thinking? What is Michel Serres here giving us in terms of any kind of analysis of the conic sections here? I mean, is it the same thing that we're seeing earlier? Is he just kind of mentioning that he's drawing from Serres here? Deleuze does who's on first, right, at the very end there. Yeah, totally. So when he's just drawing from Michel Serres, maybe he's doing like a nice little name drop of saying like this person really shows it well. In a world of infinite or variable curvature, which has lost all center, the importance of substituting point of view for the failing center. So we're looking at point of view rather than a fixed center. Makes kind of sense, as we saw from the last paragraph. Let's look at this next one. The new optical model of perception and of geometry in perception, which repudiates tactile notions such as contact and figure in favor of an architecture of vision. What do we think that means? It seems like there's almost like this emphasis on sight over touch. Am I kind of getting that right? Maybe? That it's all about the perspective you have of viewing it rather than how you maybe feel it? I don't know why. To me, that kind of reads almost like not the typical like embodiment that we see from like Deleuze. But there must be something about a tactile notion, contact and figure. So maybe when we look at like in math textbooks, figure one, the cone, maybe it's supposed to be kind of viewed as fixed in a way. It's already kind of determined what it is. So we're kind of seeing the importance of vision here. Let's look at this next part. Status of the object, which now exists only through its metamorphoses or in the declension of its profiles. So that's the objectile here, where we're seeing how an object is in a state of change or a curve in a state of change. Think about the inflection point. So that's kind of what I'm seeing. And then the last part here is perspectivism as the truth of relativity and not the relativity of the true. So this is kind of Deleuze trying to say, no, it's not that everything is relative and up in the air and that there's nothing that's true, but truth is also kind of a question of the perspective at which you view it. But is that reading as almost Platonic here? I'm not sure if anyone has an idea. Patina writes, for some reason, I'm thinking about that one Buddhist story of people touching their part of the elephant and then making claims on it. I haven't heard of this. Sounds really interesting. I just looked it up. Is it the story of the blind men and the elephant? I think it might be this. Is that it maybe? Yeah, I think so. Let me just read this out. I just Googled it and clicked on a website here. The first blind man put out his hand and touched the side of an elephant. How smooth! An elephant is like a wall. The second blind man put out his hand and touched the trunk of an elephant. How round! An elephant is like a snake. The third blind man put out his hand and touched the tusk of the elephant. How sharp! An elephant is like a spear. The fourth blind man put out his hand and touched the leg of the elephant. How tall! An elephant is like a tree. The fifth blind man reached out his hand and touched the ear of the elephant. How wide! An elephant is like a fan. The sixth blind man put out his hand and touched the tail of the elephant. How thin! An elephant is like a rope. A Republican put out their hand and said, "This is the symbol of our party." Yeah, so that's actually really interesting. I'll post this here as well. And I actually do see that, Patina. I really see what you're saying, because are any of those perspectives wrong? No, right? They're not wrong. In fact, each of those perspectives is grasping the entirety of the elephant, but from a certain perspective. And that's kind of what it sounds like to me Deleuze is doing with Leibniz's monad. So I really like how you brought that up. So this point here about truth, though, just to kind of use that also story that Patina just shared, again, this is not meaning that like truth is purely subjective. Like, again, I believe Henry Summers Hall has written that, I believe it was them in a secondary text that I read, that Deleuze is hyper-rationalist, that Deleuze is not just saying it's a free-for-all, anything might be real, there is no truth, as I think some people might read him as. But he's very much saying that the truth is appearing from a particular point of view, and the point of view lets us determine specific cases. Look right here, the power of ordering cases. And he brings in jurisprudence here, which of course, I mean, I think is awesome. I think jurisprudence and political philosophy, I mean, that's what I love. And I like how he's tying that in here. It's that, let's take a judge adjudicating a case. That's a particular point of view. And it's making me think a little bit. Yeah, it's making me think a little bit about adjudication and how, just like the story of like the kind of the blind men here, is a judge looking at a case in front of them and given their certain perspective deciding a truth about it. This is also making me think like a lot about law in general. Like, how many court cases are there? For example, are there about freedom of speech? There's a lot of court cases, and they're all different perspectives on speech. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an underlying thing we call freedom of speech either, right? Now, I'm not trying to get like Platonic and be like that right always exists, like a Lockean principle, like I have my right to this and this and this. But instead, we see that certain perspective doesn't undermine the truth of it. It's just its own perspective. So I think that adjudication point is actually really, really fascinating. I'm going to highlight that. All right. Please, everyone, also feel free to say if we're doing this right or whatever. I totally am down to listen to what other people's ideas are, even if it's just like a quick like, this reminds me of XYZ. It doesn't even need to be related. And then this last bit, I mean, this last bit is just insane about like when he's talking about invoking Henry James and the Leibniz's, point of view. I think Rudd said it best, like who's on first? I think that's kind of exactly what's happening here. With what Deleuze is talking about with the ambiguity of perspective and maybe the differences in perspective, kind of what I'm seeing. Okay, let's do the next one. If no one has anything to add, no problem. We have gone from the variable curve to the focus of the curve from the concave side, from variation to point of view, from the folds to envelopment, in short, from inflection to inclusion. The transition is insensible, somewhat like a right angle that cannot be measured by a large arc, but only by an infinitely small arc infinitely close to the summit. It is already in the summit that the angle or the inclination of the two lines is found. However, we hesitate to say that the visible is in the point of view. We would need a more natural intuition to make us admit this passage to the limit. Now, such an intuition is a very simple one. Why would something be folded, if not in order to be enveloped, placed in something else? It would seem that the envelope here takes on its ultimate sense, or rather its final sense. It is no longer an envelope of coherence or cohesion, like the egg in the reciprocal envelopment of organic parts, but nor is it a mathematical envelope of adherence or adhesion, where it is still a fold that envelops folds, as in the enveloping envelope, that touches an infinity of curves in an infinity of points. It is an envelope of adherence or of unilateral adhesion. Inclusion or adherence is the final cause of the fold, such that one moves insensibly from the latter to the former. Between the two, a delay is produced, which makes the envelope the reason of the fold. What is folded is the included, the inherent. One might say that what is folded is only virtual and only exists actually in an envelope, in something that envelops it. Okay, this is pretty interesting. A little confusing for me at some of the end here with in regard to the virtual. So I'm hoping we can work together to figure this out. But notice something here. He's talking about a transition. The transition is insensible. What is the transition? It looks like, where did he say? Oh, there it is. Inflection to inclusion. That's the transition. Now, what does that mean, though? What is that transition describing? We know what the inflection point is. We know with the inflection point that it is the moment in the curve, the point on a curve where the direction changes, or the concavity changes. So we know that. Now, what does it mean for him to talk about inclusion? So earlier we started with how there's a point of view on the curve. We have this inflection point, which is a literal distinct point on the curve. It doesn't interrupt the continuity of the curve, but it shows that there's distinctness. And then now we're talking what is enveloped or included here in said point of view. Now, what is, though? Right? What is? He says, we hesitate to say that the visible is in the point of view. Does anyone have any idea of what he's saying? Oh, really quick, I should probably also check out the footnote. Did I check out this one last time? Yeah, let's check out the footnote. One, he cites Serres. The second one, he said, for 49, which was right here, at the angle or the inclination of the two lines is found. He writes, letter to Princess Sophie. Likewise, the justification of the infinitesimal calculus would show how point A contained and conserved the relation C slash E. What are we thinking? Does anyone have any ideas here? I mean, in terms of envelopment, that's also a mathematical term. I remember Imagine was talking about it in the last reading. Um, but what's being enveloped here? Is it like every point of view? Is it is it a single point of view? I mean, yeah, I mean, like the way I'm kind of seeing it is I don't know if anyone's like done like super intense origami before because I have not, so I don't know if there's like an expression for this. But it reminds me of in super intense origami, you can have like multiple papers that you're working with and you're folding, and then you use one, like maybe a smaller one, and fold that and then make that attached to like the larger, paper. So the way that I'm kind of reading some of the envelopment here is that when the folding process occurs, it's also kind of like, I don't know, it's used to incorporate or envelop here or include other kinds of folds or other or that's kind of like my thinking here. When we're also seeing inclusion, this also makes me think of like how Deleuze is talking about immanence here. Like the fold is not made to exclude other folds, maybe, or I think of like maybe the inclusive disjunction in anti-Oedipus. So when we're talking about inclusion, you know, what are we trying? What's he saying here in terms of like an envelope? I don't know. I myself am a little lost here, especially when he says one might say that what is folded is only virtual and only exists actually in an envelope and something that envelops it. Um, I don't know if anyone remembers from last week, but we did talk about the virtual, didn't we? Deleuze says that the inflection point, from what I remember, is the virtual because at that moment or at that point of inflection, the curve is actualized in a new way. So at the level of the inflection point, there is that it's the virtual because the curve is then being actualized from said point. So now we're kind of also talking about just folding in general. What is folded is only virtual. So maybe we can also take an example of the tree seed as well. If you take a tree seed, inside of the seed, you have an infinite number of folds. Then when it's planted and it's in a relation to an external, environment, it is unfolding and folding and unfolding. And slowly what you see is this tree arising or emerging through this kind of process. Is it right to say that the seed is virtual? Is that a wrong thing to say? I'm just kind of curious what people are thinking here. Well, and one thing I'll say too is like it's the point about the seed. The reason why I bring it up, it's kind of a weird one because the seed itself is actualized already. You can hold the seed; it's already actualized. You can plant it, whatever. Now, from there, though, is Deleuze talking here about how when we fold things, there's something virtual inside of that fold, or it is the virtual, which then gives room for further actualizations. Kind of like how I'm thinking about it a little bit here. Like, if we fold an origami swan or something along those lines, can that then be used for like further folding processes and whatnot? So, I don't know. I see Rudd is typing though. I'll give you a sec. Okay, I don't know if Red was going to say anything. And also apologies for any background noise. I have like a, a cat and movement going on. But we can also come back to this too. I can kind of star this. This is also something that this book is a tough one, and the theory chat is a huge help for helping us walk through it. So maybe we can look there, and let's check this out. Also, if anyone wants to see a picture of my cat who's drinking water, I'll show you. This guy has just been a total menace lately, but we all love him. Let's see here. His name is Carl. Total menace. There he is. There. Okay. Let us continue. Thus, it is not exactly the point of view that includes, or at least, it does so only as an agent, but not as a final cause or a completed act. Inclusion or inherence has a condition of closure or closing that Leibniz puts forward in his famous formula, no windows, in which point of view is not enough to fulfill. That in which inclusion takes place and never ceases to take place, or that which includes in the sense of a completed act is not the site or the place, nor the point of view, but that which remains in the point of view, that which occupies the point of view, and without which the point of view would not be a point of view. This is necessarily a soul, a subject. It is always a soul that includes what it grasps from its point of view, that is to say, inflection. Inflection is an ideality or virtuality that exists actually only in the soul that envelops it. Moreover, it is the soul that has folds, that is full of folds. Folds are in the soul and exist actually only in the soul. This is already true of innate ideas. They are pure virtualities, pure powers, whose acts consist of habits or dispositions, folds, in the soul, and whose completed act consists of an interaction of the soul, internal deployment. But this is no less true of the world. The entire world is only a virtuality that exists actually only in the folds of the soul that expresses it. The soul bringing about internal unfolds through which it gives itself a representation of the included world. We go from inflection to inclusion in a subject, as from the virtual to the actual, inflection defining the fold, but inclusion defining the soul or subject, that is, that which envelops the fold, its final cause, and its completed act. We also see footnote 50, where he writes, "It is in this sense that Leibniz distinguishes virtuality or idea, modification, disposition, or habit, which is like the act of power in the soul, the tendency to action, and action as the ultimate actualization of the act, which is as much to say, following the sculptural metaphor, the figure of Hercules, the veins of the marble and the labor exerted on the marble to bring out these veins. See new essays, the preface, quote, beyond disposition, there's a tendency to action." Really interesting. Is there not a picture of Hercules, though? No, there's not. Okay, actually, I kind of want to include this because this might be cool. The figure of... Oh, is it just... I mean, do you think that he's referencing a specific piece here? Because he said the sculptural metaphor, figure of Hercules. I guess I'll just place any one. I'll just Google it really quick and place any picture. The figure of Hercules. I just don't know if that's a specific piece. I'm not sure. Let's see. Rudd says, "Is he a Marxist?" Oh, my cat, because his name's Carl, I think you're referring to. No, ironically not. He's like Demsock. And then Rudd says, "I was going to explain that I can't just fold my treehouse up into a seed and a set of blueprints because the fold exists. The growth in the building represent the crease and the fold." Gosh, I know it's really interesting using this kind of like tree example, and I think adding kind of like a treehouse is also interesting. But I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I like thinking of it as a blueprint too, in terms of like virtuality. That kind of, it's also how I look at like the plane of consistency a little bit. But yeah, I see what you're kind of getting at. And when we're dealing with this, I think that maybe this paragraph will help us get a bit further as well. So we just kind of talked about envelopment just right earlier, and we did talk about, like, as Red was also mentioning, like, we talked about the virtual. So, is the folded thing an actualized object? Well, it doesn't look like it. Deleuze says one might say that what is folded is only virtual. So the folded thing is not necessarily actualized, right? Like, that's what it seems to kind of be saying. I think that it needs then to exist actually in an envelope. So the fold is enveloped in what exactly? I guess in an envelope. Something that envelops it. What is that, thing? Is kind of interesting. So I guess, do you call the seed the fold? Um I guess no. I guess, or is that enveloped in relations inside of itself or outside of itself? I'm not fully sure about that virtual point. But I think this fourth paragraph might give us some stuff. So let's see. Um, Thus, it is not exactly a point of view that includes. So why is point of view not enough here? Is the first sentence here? He's kind of starting strong when he's saying that point of view. It is not point of view that includes. Oh, so I guess, is he answering our question, right? That's sort of what we were saying. Like, what is the thing then that envelops? He says it is not exactly the point of view that includes. So it's not necessarily that. Um, it does so only as an agent, but not as a final cause or a completed act. So it seems here. Yeah, okay. So it's seeming to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, this is just a difficult text. But it seems to me that he's saying that the point of view cannot necessarily organize, because it doesn't organize in the sense of matter, but it organizes in the sense of how something is being seen. So I guess that example, a little bit of like maybe Patina's like blind men and the elephant, it's that you have a certain perspective, and well, I mean, it's kind of crazy to say blind men and seen right there, right? So it's the same concept though, because they still have a perception, right? Even if it's not necessarily sight, there is still perception at work, or perspective at work. So it seems like Deleuze is almost needing some kind of thing, like a subject here, to get towards maybe part of a perspective. I'm kind of curious, but regardless, there is something that needs to include this view. It doesn't seem like the view is like outside of itself. So maybe does he need a subject? Sorry, I know that's kind of confusing when I say that, um, but it's kind of hard to word, because maybe what Deleuze is also getting at is like why there's a need for a subject in the first place as well. Is he trying to get at that point? I'm I'm not sure. But he does say that the monad has no windows. So remember, the monad for Leibniz is not looking outward. It is windowless. It has the entire. It is a perspective of the entire world, but only from its own point of view. So, is anyone making sense of this? Because I feel like I'm totally just like yapping, but I want to know what people are thinking here. Rudd, what are you saying? Rudd's writing, the seed is the virtual because it's not a real tree, but it still represents the existence of what will be the actual tree. The seed is an actual seed, but a virtual tree. Ah, really great explanation. I think that does kind of that is starting to click for me. Um, and then Rudd writes, this is how to move past Leibniz's idea, which requires observation to form distinction. Perception is separating what is into the is. Yes, Leibniz's need for a subject is why he needs a deity. It's uncaused cause as the one who sees to prove existence. Okay, Rudd, you might be going too fast for me. Let me see if I can kind of understand what you're getting at. So for Leibniz, when he's talking about, perspective, okay, his normal view is that there needs to be kind of an observation for there to be distinction, meaning that something, whether it's you, like Rudd or Noah or God, is able to look and observe and say, yes, this is different than this. And then that's how we can form distinction. But he needs a kind of subject for that process. Is that what you're trying to say? And Deleuze, of course, is going to be removing God from this equation, removing transcendent God and pre-established harmony. So maybe is he trying to get that right? Yes, perception is creation. Perception is creation. Okay. See, but Deleuze is he's not abandoning the monad here though, either. See, I think that's why this is tricky for me. It's because each monad does contain the point of view. Is that not an observation? Right? Like, is that, or are they agreeing on that kind of question there? I'm not sure. There are also an infinite number of monads, too. Is Deleuze trying to say then that there have to be just an infinite number of souls in order for the universe to not have any gaps? I think that's kind of another thing I'm already thinking about. So when he writes here, maybe this can help us also. He says that is necessarily a soul, a subject. It is always a soul that includes what it grasps from its point of view. So its own point of view, that includes what it grasps. So I'm thinking like, yeah, let me read this here. You wrote, he doesn't have to abandon the monad. What he's doing is separating the monad from theism as a prerequisite in the same way Spinoza does God. Yes, I totally hear what you're saying. Like, he doesn't need to necessarily abandon the monad, but he does need to abandon the transcendent God of pre-established harmony, right? Like, that's the kind of point. So what does he mean here, though, when he's saying that the point of view is not enough by itself? Or that, what is included in the fold is the subject. I think that's what I am kind of trying to get at here. What does that mean? And this is, I think, where it gets also some of the hardest, because Badiou's criticism of Deleuze will still be this. It'll still be that Deleuze is just replacing God with another God that he calls the differential field. So it's kind of weird. The point of view, Rudd writes, the existence of the creator is enough to justify existence in theistic presumption. I see. I'm slowly getting what you're saying at. And that also reminds me of George Berkeley a little bit. It's that observation is necessary. So what's observing everything all at once? Well, God. So Deleuze is trying to maybe get away from that here, but is he doing it successfully? You know what I mean? What is kind of interesting though is that he is talking about the subject. He's talking about the subject. He's talking about the soul. He's saying that those are those are synonymous here as he's writing it. So the point of view is occupied by a soul. That's what he's getting at. So that means that the fold is then enveloped in the soul. Am I reading that right? The soul envelops the point of view for itself. And is it possible to have a view without a soul? Because my fear with this section a little bit is Deleuze trying to get at this large hierarchy. Is he trying to say that if there's, the soul has this point of view, but does that mean, like, I think all of you have probably heard of that expression at one time or another, or that question. It's like, if a tree falls down in the forest and there's no one there to witness it, did it actually fall? Was a sound actually made? For someone like Leibniz, he has God being that large perspective of all. He has that pre-established harmony. But we also don't want to get with Deleuze that there needs to be this a priori subject, this me, and the world exists only because I see it. Because I don't think he's trying to get at that either, if that makes sense. So where am I missing, or what am I missing here? Why is it the soul? I mean, when we talk about the soul and perceptiveness, he's also making a distinction between the folds of matter and folds in the soul. So when he's talking about that, when we look at matter folds versus soul folds, he's making a distinction. Deleuze is saying that the Baroque house has a top floor and a bottom floor. What's he trying to say? How is he making this distinction? If we have the monad Noah, which has some clarity, versus maybe the monad Carl, my cat, versus a rock. Is one of these things more real than the other because it has a particular point of view? Because it's a soul? Because I'm not sure he's trying to say that. To me, a lot of this is just probably going to be hinging on the question of the virtual in a way. Um, it is everything kind of virtual purely until a soul expresses it? I guess that's the best question I can ask. Is everything virtual until a soul expresses it? Or is a soul actualizing a kind of point of view? Which is interesting. I'm not fully sure. Um, but maybe the next paragraph, I'm gonna actually highlight a little bit of this in a different color, and then of course in the DGQC we can come back to it and ask questions in the theory chat because I'm trying to understand this a little bit more. So let me highlight it. Let's continue. See if we can get anything else from this. Whence the distinction between three kinds of points as three kinds of singularities? The physical point is what passes through the inflection or the point of inflection itself. It is neither an atom nor a Cartesian point, but an elastic or plastic point fold. Thus, it is not exact. But the important point is that on the one hand, it devalorizes the exact point, and on the other hand, it leads the mathematical point to assume a new status, rigorous without being exact. On the one hand, in effect, the exact point is not a part of extension, but a conventional extremity of the line. On the other hand, the mathematical point in turn loses exactitude in order to become position, site, focus, place, the place of conjunction for the vectors of curvature. In short, point of view. The latter thus takes on a genetic value. Pure extension will be the continuation or diffusion of the point, but in accordance with the relations of distance that define space between two given points, as the place of all places. However, if the mathematical point in this way ceases to be the extremity of the line in order to become depth of focus, it nonetheless remains a simple modality. It is in the body, in the extended thing. But for this reason, as we have seen, it is only the projection of a third point in the body. This is the metaphysical point, the soul or the subject, that which occupies the point of view, that which is projected in the point of view. The soul is not in a body as a point, but is itself a higher point and of another nature that corresponds to the point of view. We can therefore distinguish between the point of inflection, the point of position, and the point of inclusion. So at the end there, hold up. We have this point. Wait, hold on. I want to find all of them. The mathematical point. Let me see. Hold on. The mathematical point, metaphysical point. What was the other one? That's the third point. Hold on. What was the first? It, let me see. Hold on. The physical point. Sorry about that. Um, okay. So there are three kinds. There are three kinds of points: physical point, the mathematical point, and the metaphysical point. The physical point here is that, how can we define the physical point? That's actually the first question then. What is the physical point trying to get at? One thing I'm noticing is that that's the point of inflection, right? The point of inflection. That's maybe how we can define the physical point, is that there is, in this process, an operation of folding, the physical inflection by which the curve, the physical. It's kind of weird though, because he also talks about the point of inflection being virtual, right? Which is kind of weird that he's also calling it physical, because when I see that word physical, I'm kind of already thinking of something actual. But I guess that means that the physical point is what passes through the inflection or the point of inflection. It is a plastic point fold. Oh, so maybe here I'm reading it wrong. The physical point passes through the point of inflection. So I'm wondering if he's just trying to get at, like, it's that process by which the curve is changing and it's passing through. Not fully kind of sure. He calls it this elastic or plastic point fold. So, this is all that I'm thinking about here, to make it simple to understand, is that the physical point here is not the exact fixed point that we kind of see in a Cartesian metaphysics or a Cartesian view of matter, or the kind of point in, Zeno's paradox. That's kind of like what I think that is. The mathematical point. Anyone want to take this? What do we think the mathematical point is? Kind of short here. However, if the mathematical, he defines it up here. Sorry. There it is. The mathematical point in turn loses exactitude in order to become position, site, focus, place of conjunction for vectors of a curvature. So it looks like the mathematical point is how the curve is changing, or the perspective of it. So the focus, the place, the position. So there's kind of a difference there. And then lastly, we have the metaphysical point, which is the soul or the subject. So there are these three kinds of points that he's isolating. Gosh, this is brutal. Rudyard says, quote, "Anyone want to do the mathematical point?" Says a server full of humanities majors, and they're all shuddering in unison. Yes, this is why it's just, this is a little bit brutal for kind of maybe those of us that aren't hardcore mathematicians. But also, to be fair a little bit here, notice that this is also not like, in a way, it's not reminding me of like a calc class at all, right? Like, he's kind of just using math. I don't want to say is decorative at all, because I don't think he is. I think Deleuze is much smarter than that. But part of it does feel a little bit like he's using that to kind of isolate it, to make a little bit more sense of what he's kind of getting at too. But yeah, this is a bit brutal without the math, for sure, without that background. And then notice too that the metaphysical point, the soul, he's saying that it is not in a body. It is not inside of a body. It's not like there is this monad Noah inside of Noah's body. It's just occupying a higher point of view. And it includes then what it is projected in the point of view, right? Isn't that what it says? Yeah. So this is reminding me of Spinoza's parallelism between the mind and the body, the individual mind and the individual body. This is kind of saying something similar here with what Deleuze is getting at. I, say my name is Noah. I raise my hand, I walk, I go about my life. how can Noah say, I raised my hand? How come the soul monad is able to connect with in such an interrelated way with the raising of the hand or the walking or the movement of the body? What, like, if the soul monad is not inside of Noah's body, then why does Noah not have an intrinsic relationship to something completely else across the universe or across the world or something like that? Yeah, Rudd, you say the good news is that the math is more used as proof of idea rather than arithmetic. Yeah, bingo. I think I want to save this like wording, screenshotting it, because I think you're totally right, and that's what makes me feel just a little bit more comfortable reading this text too. Um, Rudd also is writing. So the first point is the physical point, the point of inflection. It's non-Cartesian. It is the fold. Yes. What makes me weary is that he does say it passes through the inflection, which is kind of interesting because I also read this as the inflection, but he also says it's an elastic or plastic point fold. So that's kind of how he's defining it. Um, then he writes that then Rudd writes, they write that the mathematical point can also be Cartesian or the point of view. This is not exactly important. Is that on the one hand? To assume a new status. Yeah, rigorous without being exact. And you know what's crazy about that rigorous without being exact line? It reminds me of when D&G say this. They're talking about this here in terms of smooth space in 1,000 plateaus. They say the term when you're trying to measure Riemannian space, it is inexact. What did they say? It is inexact yet rigorous. Here, he says that it's rigorous without being exact. Interesting. So that's trying to take the normal striated space. Oh, okay, that makes sense, Red. Yeah, totally. And it's making sense because when he starts with what he calls the physical point, which is the inflection point, he's showing how the second we view it in that manner, we're now elevating geometry or mathematics away from that major science into maybe a minor one, to use the language of ATP. Or maybe to go from the normative mathematics to a Baroque mathematics, or Euclidean to Riemannian space. So he's showing that we can now use it like that. Rudd writes, I love neo-Riemannian theory, but that's musical theory, not math theory. But, maybe. I know Deleuze and Guattari use that example, right? You try and measure two sounds of different pitch but equal intensity versus two sounds of equal intensity but different pitch, right? Like, what is the method by which you use to measure those sounds? It's not going to be a ruler, right? So I think music and math, of course, they have a great relationship. So then once you elevate, the physical point to this kind of level, you're also you're viewing the mathematical point differently. You're not viewing it like Zeno or Descartes. You're viewing it in the question of position and location and place and function. Location might be kind of a weird one because you can have like strict coordinates and whatnot. But position, site, focus, place of conjunction for the vectors of a curvature. And then finally you have that metaphysical point. So that's where with him just kind of it sounds like this is like a nice little summary that Deleuze is giving us of the points that we've gone over thus far. I still, for me, do not think that this clarifies at all the role of the subject in the previous paragraph. So that's still something like the role of the subject in the virtual here, a little frustrating for me in that previous paragraph. I don't know if anyone else, relates. Again, I'm hoping we can eventually come back to this and figure this out. Yeah. Maybe let me actually read this last sentence really quick from that previous paragraph. It just kind of caught my eye. He writes, quote, we go from inflection to inclusion in a subject, as from the virtual to the actual, inflection defining the fold, but inclusion defining the soul or the subject. That is that which envelops the fold. It's so interesting. I know that people were talking about Hume in the theory chat here. It's making me think of the subject surpassing the given, right? But inflection to inclusion is akin to virtual to the actual. Inflection defines it, the fold, inclusion defines the subject. So we need a little bit more work there, in my opinion. And then Rudd writes, Neo-Riemannian theory produces tone nets where all the sounds have a vector relationship between tones. That is awesome. You're going to have to link me some of that. I just have so much on my reading list, but that sounds really fun. Okay, if we are ready to move on, and if anyone also has any thoughts on that paragraph, like the earlier paragraph about the subject, please feel free to say something. But let's continue. I actually do think we can finish this. We're actually pretty close to being done with chapter 2 today. A few more paragraphs. We know the name that Leibniz will give to the soul or subject as a metaphysical point, monad. He borrows this name from the Neoplatonists, who used it to designate a state of the one, a unity insofar as it envelops a multiplicity. This multiplicity developing the one in the manner of a series. More exactly, the one has a power of envelopment and development, while the multiple is inseparable from the folds it makes when it is enveloped, and from the unfold when it is developed. But its envelopments and developments, its implications and explications, are still particular movements that must be comprised in a universal unity that complicates them all, and that complicates all the ones. It is Giordano Bruno who will push the system of monads to the level of this universal complication, the soul of the world that complicates everything. The Neoplatonic emanations allowed for a large zone of immanence, even if the rights of a transcendent God or a still superior unity were formally respected. Explication, implication, complication form the triad of the fold, following the variations of the one-multiple relation. But if we ask why the name monad remains connected with Leibniz, it is because of the two directions Leibniz followed fixing the concept. On the one hand, the mathematics of inflection allowed him to posit the series of the multiple as a convergent infinite series. On the other hand, the metaphysics of inclusion allowed him to posit the enveloping unity as an irreducible individual unity. In effect, as long as the series remained finite or indefinite, individuals risked being relative, called upon to merge into a universal spirit or world soul capable of complicating all the series. But if the world is an infinite series, it thereby constitutes the logical comprehension of a notion or concept that can now only be individual. It is thus enveloped by an infinity of individuated souls, each of which retains its own irreducible point of view. It is the accord of the singular points of view, or harmony, that will replace the universal complication and ward off the dangers of pantheism or immanence. Hence, Leibniz's insistence on denouncing the hypothesis, or rather the hypostasis, of a universal spirit, which would turn complication into an abstract operation in which individuals would founder. Let's take a look quickly. Hold on. I accidentally missed a couple. Okay, hold on. From the past paragraph, I missed a couple of the footnotes. I just want to double check. 51 on the scholastic conception of the point and of the different cases that inspired Leibniz, see Bohm. And then in another letter to Lady Masham, the soul, quote, Leibniz says, the soul must be placed in the body where its point of view is, according to which the soul represents to itself the universe presently. To wish for something more and to enclose souls within the dimensions is to desire to imagine souls as bodies. Interesting. So that's back to the souls as bodies point. But in this paragraph we just read, he cites a couple things. See Proclus, and then he says Giordano Bruno, the theory of complicatio had already been developed by Nicholas of Cusa. See Maurice de Gondelac. Now, interestingly enough, in this paragraph, we're slowly starting to get a little bit more from Deleuze that I'm liking. Okay, here This is where he's going to kind of go and attack the kind of Neoplatonist view, or at least what he's doing, in my opinion, is preempting the Neoplatonist objection to someone like Leibniz or even to himself. Now, he cites Nicholas of Cusa, and Nicholas of Cusa was um, he honestly wrote about he was kind of one of the first writers of the fold in general, much longer, hundreds of years before Deleuze. And Nicholas of Cusa was a Neoplatonist. Now, for those who maybe not aren't familiar with Neoplatonism, it's uh, it's kind of it's kind of the view that nature emanates from God. The way that I like to think about it is the normal Thomistic view, and I say that normal because I'm in the United States, is that the kind of Thomistic view, the classic Christian view you see today, is that God created nature from nothing, ex nihilo. God created it, and then turned it on, and it's going forward. And God created nature from nothing. The way that someone described Neoplatonism to me is take a pot of boiling water. That is God. God as a pot of boiling water. And then the bubbles from the pot boil over, and that's nature. So nature is not necessarily separate from God, right, according to Neoplatonists. It's just an emanation from God. Now we have to remember, Deleuze is against this view because he believes that this still upholds the one. It still upholds God as primary. And he wants to get away from that kind of transcendent logic. Now, let's look at it knowing and keeping that in mind. We see that Leibniz is borrowing from the Neoplatonists. Okay. That's why the Neoplatonists use this idea of a monad, or this point, to designate a state of the one. So they're using this as God is this single unity, and everything emanates from said unity. Maybe this unity envelops a multiplicity. Or actually, hold on. Yeah, correct. Um, so how can we say? Well, I'm a little confused with this series, this multiplicity developing the one in a manner of series. Any idea there? Yeah, I guess that's from Proclus here. But I don't know if there's anyone familiar with like Neoplatonism here, but he talks about how the one, in a way, contains the many here, I guess. And maybe the view is that the one kind of unfolds akin to this like progressing kind of series. Another famous Neoplatonist was Pseudo Dionysius, who, and same with Plotinus, who we'll see in the next paragraph, I believe. And their kind of view is that if nature emanates from God, then there is this hierarchy, where, think about like goodness. Some things are more good than others. So the Neoplatonists, they kind of view the one. Maybe you can look at it like the sun, right? Like that's the one, and the rays of the sun emanate from the sun. And the closer you are to the one, like the more in tune you are with God. The farther away you are, you're still an emanation of the one, but you're also farther away. So that's what I'm thinking he's talking about how it unfolds in this kind of manner of series for the Neoplatonists. Um, but he's trying to say that Leibniz, even though Leibniz is taking this monad, he is not the same as the Neoplatonists here. Why is the kind of question? What's he trying to say, like, distinguishes Leibniz here? We look at a little bit of what Deleuze is saying. Look at this quote. It's really interesting. The Neoplatonic emanations allowed for a large zone of immanence, even if the rights of a transcendent God were formally respected. So Deleuze is honestly kind of like, also in Deleuze's early career too, by the way, he was heavily influenced by Nicholas of Cusa. And I only know this because I had a professor years ago who he was Christian, and he wrote an essay about Deleuze and the relationship between Deleuze and Nicholas of Cusa. So so Deleuze, from what I know and from what I've read, was influenced heavily by the kind of Neoplatonist tradition, specifically also Nicholas of Cusa. So here it seems like he's giving them some credibility. He's saying like, hey, the Neoplatonists, they kind of are allowing for this kind of zone of immanence. It's like they're not saying nature's divorced from God completely. It's like severed off. Um, but he's also saying that there is this, transcendent God. Um, Bettina says, have you read the Hermetic Deleuze? There's a whole bunch on this in that book. It's so funny that you bring that up. I just put that in the theory chat, and I think Ben commented. So that's on my list. I have it literally on my desktop to read next. I just don't know what chapter to check out. But yeah, that Neoplatonist kind of Deleuze outlook is interesting, and I know some people here probably won't like it, but sometimes I oscillate, with like the Neoplatonism side versus like the complete immanent side, right? And yeah, of course, I'll check out Ben's recommendation too. Um, and I know Rudd, it's like, yeah, sometimes I oscillate with that Neoplatonism a little bit, but I do so because I mean, what we're seeing here, and I think where we've been going back and forth in this reading is, can Deleuze properly replace Leibniz's God, which establishes pre-established harmony, with something that is not transcendent, right? And we'll see if he can kind of get there. Really quick, let's take a look here. There was this like triad here that, where was that triad of what is it? The fold. It reminded me of Deleuze's Expressionism, his first book on Spinoza, that doctoral thesis, I believe it was, or one of them. Where is it? Did anyone see explication? Oh, there it is. There it is. Explication, implication, complication form the triad of the fold. Now, when Deleuze is writing about Spinoza, he's writing about how Spinoza his worry with Spinoza is that Spinoza's upholding the primacy of substance. So when Deleuze is responding or trying to read Spinoza, he's trying to say, what if we sort of view substance as implication and explication? So it feeds into the modes, and the modes feed right back into the substance simultaneously. So it's not that substance is prior to the modes, it's that the modes are substance, it's substance in and of itself, and the modes themselves can be understood also as primary. And he talks about that concept of explication and implication. And then complication, I'm a little unsure of, just because I haven't fully read at all Expressionism. That's all I know is like the implication, explication stuff. But it's kind of interesting here that I think Deleuze is saying that in each fold, it's all doing that. Every time you fold or unfold, it brings the fold anew all over again with each folding and unfolding. He's saying that seems to be intrinsic to this process of folding. So there doesn't need to be this external God. There doesn't need to be an operator who's actually doing the folding, akin to a human performing, the art of origami. You don't need a God doing, that same thing with reality or nature or kind of his metaphysics. So, implication would be, folding inside, making the fold. Explication to me means the unfolding. And then complication is to me, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but complication to me is like that quote unquote finished product. It is like the origami swan that you make. And then the process, of course, is immediately starting over again. And all of this is happening at once. Now, interestingly, the complication itself, to me, seems to be the unity for Deleuze. That you don't need a unity that's beyond. It's already unified through the folding and unfolding process. So that's kind of how I'm reading this section a little bit. I do note the universal spirit was mentioned a couple times. He's also talking about pantheism a little bit here. Does anyone have any thoughts on what Deleuze is doing here? Let me see. What's the danger of immanence? That's probably a good question here. Um, he says, let's see. It is the accord of the singular points of view or harmony that will replace the universal complication. That's the Neoplatonist view. It's got to be the universal complication, right? Is anyone thinking that? Um, as if there's like a finished product already that things are like emanating from. And ward off the dangers of pantheism or immanency. What would the danger be? Is that just saying that the universal complication is able to solve the foundational problem of pantheism and immanence? Maybe. So then Leibniz comes in and he has to get rid of this idea of a universal spirit where he's like, no, instead, complication is now an abstract operation. I don't know if anyone's in agreement there. So maybe unlike, I mean, it also seems like a little like jab to like maybe Hegel as well. But in this section, it is clear that Deleuze is sort of showing that Neoplatonism maybe was like a step forward, but also two steps back, and how Leibniz is drawing from them in a productive way by showing that, hey, we do not need this universal God doing the operating of folding. Instead, we don't need a universal spirit that everything now just gets dissolved into. Rather, because each monad is completely whole, and because each monad encompasses the entirety of the world from its own point of view, then that's the reason why we don't need something transcendent. But it does seem like Deleuze is admitting a bit here that there is this level of complication for each monad, and he also can't do away completely with, he can't do away completely without pre-established harmony. So he is showing here that, I guess, for Leibniz, what is replacing this Neoplatonist God for Leibniz? What's replacing that is just harmony itself between all monads. It's that the fact that there can be harmony without all of them collapsing into the one, or all of them collapsing into an absolute one or spirit. So to me, that's what that reads as a little bit here. It's kind of a weird paragraph, but that's how I read it. Again, I'm still kind of waiting for him to come back to the idea of the soul and the subject from the paragraph a couple paragraphs ago, but I don't really see that yet. So that might be something we need to just theory chat with people in the Discord. All right, let's move on to the next one. And by the way, everyone, there's only like 3-ish more paragraphs or something, so we're almost done with the second chapter. All this remains obscure. For if Leibniz, by pushing to its limit a metaphor sketched by Plotinus, turns the monad into a kind of point of view on the city, must we understand that a certain form corresponds to each point of view? For example, a street with this or that form? In conic sections, there is not one point of view to which the ellipse would refer, and another for the parabola, and another for the circle. The point of view, the summit of the cone, is the condition under which one grasps the set of the variation of forms or the series of curves of the second degree. It is not even enough to say that the point of view grasps a perspective, a profile that would present, in each case, the entirety of the city in its own manner. For what it also makes appear is the connection between all the profiles, the series of all the curvatures or inflections. What is grasped in a point of view is thus neither a determined street nor its determinable relation with other streets, which are constants, but the variety of all the possible connections between the trajectories of one street to another. The city as an orderable labyrinth. The infinite series of curves or inflections is the world, and the entire world is included in the soul under a point of view. Ah, this is just so fire. Okay, let's check out really quick. Oh, I totally didn't see this footnote from the previous paragraph, but let's check that out real fast. This is why Leibniz does not take up the term complicatio, despite the attraction he has for the words and the notions that translate the fold. Let me go back because I wanted to see. Yeah, I guess he just doesn't want to be carrying the baggage of the word complicatio, maybe. Okay, and then from this past paragraph, I really love this one. 56 in the Enneads, which is one of Plotinus's like foundational texts, or magnum opus. See Plotinus's concise sentence: "We multiply the city without its founding this operation." That's heat. And then he also says, see Discourse on Metaphysics, the Monadology. Each mind being, as it were, a little divinity in its own department. Each mind being a little divinity in its own department. Okay, so this paragraph, I love this one. And when he's talking about the views of the city, this is the one where when I first read The Fold, I was like, oh, this, for me, it clicked a little bit because I think I didn't understand anything else that came before. Similar to how I view it now. So what's the point of Deleuze here clarifying point of view? This is important. What is Deleuze here clarifying about point of view? And this is maybe to me, and this is what's hard, but this is maybe to me backtracking a little bit, saying, what if I got it wrong earlier? Because when he's talking here about cones, you can cut a cone in a specific angle or direction that will allow you to view it from a certain point of view. For example, with the cone, you have the and I'll also throw it right back in the Discord chat, but you have the circle, parabola, whatever kind of perspective here. So is it that one point of view is the parabola and the other is the ellipse or the circle?
I think it's like, am I audible, by the way?
Oh yeah, for sure. Thanks for
Is it like, this is like my first time joining a call, so it's like appropriate for me to talk. I'm so sorry, I should have asked before that.
No, this is great. Thanks so much for. I think everyone's just been chatting in the chat, but I mean, I love hearing people talk too. So what are
Okay.
you thinking here from this? Yeah.
I'm thinking it's almost like he's shifting from a geometric order to a topological one, where what we're looking at are um, like transformations, like a space of transformation rather than a particular geometric point that looks in its own perspective, but like more like a I'm sorry, I think that's as far as I'm getting right now.
No, thank you so much. And I think you're right here. I think that it's not necessarily that a perspective is only a circle or only an ellipse. Viewing it topologically, viewing it where you have the entire series of variations all present at once, and then the perspective does make out the a circle, right? For example, and I think that makes a lot of sense. In fact, Bettina here gave us that story of the blind men touching the parts of the elephant. Depending on which part of the elephant they touched, they were touching the elephant, but they all had a kind of different perspective. So it's making me think of that a little bit, and that I think is nice. Um, and you don't even just need to use geometry here, even though of course this is like the big part of the book, the math portion. But he's also talking about the point of view of the city with Plotinus. And if you haven't read the Aeneid, I totally recommend it. And I never I don't think I've said that in the reading, like I recommend reading XYZ, but I think Plotinus is a really fun kind of author to check out in the new Platonist literature. But when he talks about the point of view of the city here, what's how can we tie that similarly to the cone? Does anyone have any kind of idea there? What does the point of view grasp in the city? Is it grasping a street and a house and all of this, or or what? What is grasped in a point of view is thus neither a determined street nor its determinable relation with other streets, but the variety of all the possible connections between the trajectories of one street or to another, the city as an orderable labyrinth. It kind of makes me think of how if you take a city, maybe like one in which you grew up, it's like you know the outline of it, but you have a single perspective of it given, the house or apartment or wherever you resided in. But everyone also has that different relation. So there are these infinite number of kind of perspectives of that kind of city. It's not just that one only sees this kind of street, but rather it seems to me like one is seeing a series of variations of that same city, how a street connects to another, how to get from point A to point B. So there's almost like that level of gradation and change too, especially as if you're living in a space, you become more familiar with, the streets and, faster ways to get home and, things of that nature. So it's pretty amazing here. I don't know. I just really appreciate that example. And then he ends here, the infinite series of curves or reflections is the world, and the entire world is included in the soul under a point of view. So he ends here by showing that the world is an infinite series of curves. And we noted that the inflection point is the virtual. It allows the curve to be actualized via the concavity. However, all of the world, though, even though there's an infinite series of curves, right? All the entirety of it is under a single point of view via the soul. Again, I still feel a little lost on the soul, given that one paragraph to me was a little bit confusing. Like, is it just the fact that the soul perceives it? I mean, Deleuze would obviously make a distinction, I am sure, between a monad that, of the soul versus, matter that like a rock or something, right? So I'm still not sure how the entire world is enveloped in the monad soul compared to other point folds like elastic and plastic forces. But maybe we won't get that answer today. Um, and maybe too, one thing I'll add here is that maybe the whole point is that the soul it doesn't even contain any part of the world. And I think that's the hard thing that maybe I'm even grasping with Leibniz. It's that the monad isn't containing the world. It's not like a little atom that contains part of the entire whole. It's a perspective. So when you talk about perspectives, I mean, I would take that to mean that there's an infinite number, of perspectives, but maybe, I mean, are there? I don't know. I mean, I'm sure Deleuze is going to say yes, there are. But that distinction between the soul and the soul slash subject versus the object, quote unquote, is a little confusing to me, especially when he's kind of blurring the distinction between subject and object, right? Yeah, I see Patina. I see you're typing here. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything you want to say. Patina writes, I think it's just the principle of sufficient reason. If you're trying to give a reason for something, it sprawls out to eventually the entire universe. So the monad envelops the totality within itself. I think because of the adherence to this principle. Yeah, I mean, you say, sorry, I don't know why I had a period there. I think because of this adherence to the principle. Yeah, that to me does make sense. But my question is more though, and you're right. But my question is that the monad that you mentioned, that's only the soul monad? So like what about plastic inelastic forces? Like, are monads not foundational to their existence? Because for Leibniz, it's nothing but the monad, right? If you have the compounds, but then you have the pure and simple substances, which are the monad. So I think the confusing thing for me is like that role of the soul in that perspective. Because for a monad, maybe that isn't a soul, that doesn't have that same level of clarity. Does that doesn't exist? You know what I'm saying? And if that doesn't exist, does that mean that there are now gaps in reality? So I've been thinking through that a little bit. It also makes me feel that Deleuze might be a little arbitrary here when we're talking about the soul. Like, if I wake up in the morning and I'm groggy, I mean, that's a soul. What about that in relation to like an animal or a plant or something like that? So that level of clarity does seem to be kind of interesting to me about the perspective of the world. So so yeah. Yeah. And then Meyer writes, maybe the monad itself is the distribution of forces. Like there's no separating the monad from the distribution of forces present. Maybe the monad is the distribution of forces. Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? Like the monad is definitely not like an atom next to an atom like we normally think about in Leibniz or how we classically understood it, right? Um, and you say there's no separating the monad from the distribution of forces present. Right. But then here's my question, Meyer. It's like, is the monad not also foundational for that distribution of forces? Because I was under the impression that the monad is more of the foundation here. But maybe it's more along the lines that the pre-established harmony is the foundation and everything's on top of that, maybe. So that's where I'm getting a little confused with like, how can Deleuze talk about there being the soul monad and that has perspective, but what about everything else? And Patina says, it is a bit of a whiplash for Deleuze to be making use of soul too, especially after Anti-Oedipus. Yeah, totally. I mean, it sounds really off for him. I mean, even someone like Foucault writes that, uh, what does he say? The soul is a prison of the body, right? Like there are these kind of uses of that term which is a bit weird here. Yeah, so what does he mean by soul? Because he's not trying to say it's a subject of interiority, but via that one paragraph, when he talks about how the soul has a unique perspective, um, and the monad soul does compared to maybe a plastic or elastic force, that kind of scares me a little bit, right? It seems like there is a weird like subject object divide. All right, let us finish this reading. We have 2 or 1 paragraphs left, so we can get this done. I'll start here. Oh, really quick. Meyer wrote, it's because he loved Klasowski. Yeah, probably. Okay. The world is the infinite curve that touches an infinity of curves in an infinity of points, the curve with a unique variable, the convergent series of all series. But why then is there not a single and universal point of view? Why does Leibniz so strongly deny the doctrine of a universal spirit? Why are there several points of view in several irreducible souls and infinity? Consider the series of 12 sounds. It is susceptible in its turn to many variations, not only rhythmic and melodic variations, but variations that follow the contrary movement, or a retrogradable movement. With even greater reason, an infinite series, even if the variable is unique, is inseparable from an infinity of variations that constitute it. We necessarily take it following all possible orders, and one by one we privilege this or that partial sequence. It is only here that a form, a street, recovers its rights, but only in relation to the entire series. Each monad, as an individual unity, includes the whole series. It thereby expresses the entire world, but it does not express the world without expressing more clearly a small region of the world, a department, a neighborhood of the city, a finite sequence. Two souls do not have the same order, but neither do they have the same sequence, the same clear or clarified region. One could even say that, to the degree that it is filled with folds to infinity, the soul can nonetheless unfold a small number of them within itself, those that constitute its department or its courtier, neighborhood. See, oh, see Discourse on Metaphysics, Monology. Oh, each mind being, as it were, a little divinity, its own department. Okay, maybe I read that earlier on accident. I must, yeah, I must have. Okay, we should not yet see this a definition of individuation. If only individuals exist, it is not because they include the series in a certain order and according to a given region. It is even the inverse. At the moment, we only have a nominal definition of the individual. It is enough, however, to show that there is necessarily an infinity of souls and an infinity of points of view. Although each included soul and each point of view grasps the infinitely infinite series. Each grasps or includes it in a different order and following a different courtier. Let us return to the elementary schema of the two foci of inflection. In truth, each of them is a point of view on inflection in its entirety, but in an inverse order, retrograde movement, in accordance with an opposed department, one of the two branches. Okay, so this might be where we're getting a little closer, I think, to the kind of question that we had earlier. So the question I think Deleuze is asking then is, if the world is an infinite curve that touches all other curves, then why is there not a single point of view? And I think that's kind of a good question here. Like, why not have one point of view? Why does there need to be an infinite amount of them? And why does Leibniz have to reduce this down to like one or several, or sorry, not one, but several souls? So I think part of it here is that because the world is an infinite curve, the way that I'm reading this is that means that there has to be maybe an ordering or an expression of this that is infinite. Okay? So even if there is one infinite series here, there needs to be different perspectives of each part of the series, if that makes sense. I mean, to me, this seems a little bit like a metaphysical commitment we have to make with Deleuze. Like, it seems like we kind of have to just be like, hey, there has to be an infinite amount. Like, that's more likely. Patina says, a single perspective seems to suggest homogeneity, while infinite perspective suggests heterogeneity. Right. And it's tricky because they're also still the same. But I think what Deleuze is maybe saying too is like, yes, infinite perspectives suggest heterogeneity, but isn't it all of the same world anyways? So if it's all the same world, like why, like who cares? Like why can't there be this homogeneous perspective? But I think though, given this kind of individuation and like continuity in Leibniz, like I'm saying, I think that this might require a little bit of a metaphysical kind of just commitment to Deleuze. I mean, at some point we have to commit and just be like, yeah, I think that makes sense. There needs to be an infinite number of them. But he gives this example of the series of sounds. I'm really not sure what that entails. Let's take a look here, Patina. This might actually, because I think you're right here, but let's take a look. An infinite series, okay, is inseparable from an infinity of variations that constitute it. So I think, Patina, you're right. If there is a single perspective, that might maybe assumes a single unity or a single variation, which isn't even a variation at all, right? So then maybe we're back to that Neoplatonist view where everything is just emanating from the one. Or we're back to the primacy of substance, or we're back to the primacy of the one over the multiple. And so because this constitutes an infinite number of variations, there needs to be each monad including the entirety of the series in its own way. See, it says it does not, the monad does not express the world without expressing a small region of the world. Two souls do not have the same order, but neither do they have the same sequence, the same clear or clarified region. So, kind of interesting that he calls this like a department or a neighborhood here. So, it's still a question of clarity. And this is why, and this is why I'm still of the belief that even though he said soul here, and in terms, he's talking about soul and the monad, patina, even though he's talking about soul and the monad, I still kind of think, though, that he's also getting at just clarity of monads in general, right? Because there's still an infinite number of monads. He's talking about an infinite number of these substances that have an infinite number of perspectives on the world. And because he's getting away from that subject object divide, when he's talking about the soul, I do think he's talking about a certain level of clarity in the monad, one that can even conceptualize a neighborhood in relation to a city. Whereas some kinds of monads at the bottom floor, right, at the level of plastic and elastic forces, might not even be able to do that much, right? Like I'm thinking about like that the monad, at one moment uh, has less clarity than another moment, or some have just utmost clarity while some don't have much. So I still, I'm going to lean on the side of caution here by saying that Deleuze isn't saying there's only soul monads and that the soul monads um, determine like reality or anything like that. I still think he's saying that it's just a question of clarity. That's kind of how I'm reading his view of the monad. Um, yeah, that's kind of how I view this. Anything else here? Schema. No, I feel good with this. Let's maybe check this out. We should not yet see in this a definition of individuation. If only individuals exist, it is not because they include the series in a certain order and according to a given region. It is even the inverse. At the moment, we only have a nominal definition of individual. So he's not defining individual now, but it looks like I would have defined an individual as, oh, each monad has its own sequence and ordering. But he's saying the opposite. If only individuals exist, it is not because they include the series in a certain order. It is the inverse. But then he doesn't explain. He's like, yeah, that's just a nominal definition of the individual. So maybe we're not there yet. But now I'm starting to think like, gosh, what does individuation mean if that's not it? Kind of a tough text. Okay. I just want to finish this final paragraph. And I do have to leave. I'm sorry. But again, thanks everyone for showing up. But let's get this done so we can finish chapter 2. And please comment, of course. But why is it necessary to start with the world or the series? If this were not so, the theme of the mirror and the point of view would lose all meaning. We go from inflections of the world to inclusion in subjects. How is this possible, since the world does not exist except in subjects that include it? Oh my gosh, is this literally the question we've been asking the whole time? Oh my gosh, I think this is literally it. Lol. Okay, how is this possible since the world does not exist except in the subjects that include it? It is the early letters to Arnauld that detail the conciliation of two essential propositions in this regard. On the one hand, the world in which Adam sinned only exists in Adam the sinner, and in all other subjects that make up this world. On the other hand, God creates not Adam the sinner, but the world in which Adam sinned. In other words, if the world is in the subject is no less for the world. God produces the world before creating souls, since he creates them for this world that he puts in them. It is even in this sense that the law of the infinite series, the law of curves, is no longer in the soul. even though the series is, and even though the curves are. It is in this sense, too, that the soul is a production, a result. It results from the world that God has chosen. Because the world is in the monad, each monad includes the whole series of the states of the world. But because the monad is for the world, none of them clearly contains the reason of the series of which they are all a result, and which remains external to them as the principle of their accord. And at this juncture, Deleuze has this footnote from the monadology on the law of curvatures. He has see the clarification of the difficulties which Mr. Bale has found in the new system of the union of soul and body. He writes, surely we can say that the law of seriality is enveloped in the soul in confusion, but what is in the soul, in this sense, is less the law than the means of executing it. We thus go from the world to the subject at the price of a torsion that makes the world exist actually only in subjects, and also makes the subjects all relate to this world as to the virtuality that they actualize. When Heidegger attempts to go beyond intentionality as an all too empirical determination of the subject-world relation, he sees that the Leibnizian formula of the monad without windows is a path to this overcoming, since design, he says, is already open at all times, and has no need of windows by which an opening would come to it. But in this manner, he misunderstands the condition of closure or concealment enunciated by Leibniz, that is, the determination of a being for the world instead of a being in the world. Ooh, gosh, that's so heat. Closure is the condition of being for the world. The condition of closure is valid for the infinite opening of the finite. It finitely represents infinity. It gives to the world the possibility of beginning over again in each monad. The world must be placed in the subject in order for the subject to be for the world. This is the torsion that constitutes the fold of the world and the soul, and it is what gives expression its fundamental character. The soul is the expression of the world, actuality, but because the world is the express of the soul, virtuality. Thus, God creates expressive souls only because he creates the world that they express by including it, from inflection to inclusion. Finally, in order for the virtual to be incarnated or effectuated, is something necessary other than this. Finally, in order for the virtual to be incarnated or effectuated, is something necessary other than this actualization in the soul? Is not a realization in matter also necessary so that the folds of this matter would come to reduplicate the folds in the soul? We cannot yet know this, although the preceding chapter invites us to believe it. This is literally what we were saying, like at the end here. Look at this. This is literally what we were trying to get at this whole time. Like, he doesn't make it easy. Okay? I love this man Deleuze. He doesn't make it easy. But this is really interesting. And it's also kind of fascinating. He's drawing on Heidegger too, because their relationship is weird. But he cites Heidegger, The Basic Problems of Phenomenology. He writes, it looks like Heidegger writes, as a monad, design needs no window to see what is outside, not, as Leibniz believes, because everything is already accessible inside its capsule, because the monad, design, in its own being, transcendence, is already outside. Then Deleuze writes, Merleau-Ponty has a much better comprehension of Leibniz when he posited simply that our soul has no windows. That means Indurweltsein. In the phenomenology of perception, Merleau-Ponty had invoked the fold in order to oppose it to Sartrean wholes, and the visible and the invisible it is a question of interpreting the Heideggerian fold as a chiasm or interlace between the visible and the seeing. So it looks like there's also a big Merleau-Ponty shout out here, showing that his kind of view versus Heidegger's view is better. So this is kind of Deleuze, it seems like, transitioning to the question that we were trying to figure out. Like, he did a lot of the work now. At the end of this chapter, we can successfully say that we have a decent grasp on the folds of matter and the Baroque house and the soul, folds in the soul. What we do not understand yet, though, what we don't understand yet is that question of perspective, that question of the subject, the soul, in relation to the object. And knowing Deleuze, we know, especially from earlier, he is trying to kind of eradicate this subject-object dichotomy. So he, it sounds like, is also questioning here that we need to figure this out, and it just sounds like he's asking that kind of question. One thing to start with, though, is he does kind of answer this with the idea of a subject being in the world and for the world. Okay? Does anyone have any idea of the importance of being in the world versus being for it? Uh, the way that I kind of see it is that we're we shouldn't be looking at the monad or the soul or the subject as being placed in the world, akin to how God placed Adam in the Garden of Eden, um, which then Adam became a sinner in the world. If we look at the subject being for the world, I think it looks a little bit different. So Adam's point of view here can only be coherent if there is a particular world that allows for its expression. For Adam to be a sinner, there needs to be the world in which Adam is a sinner that allows for the constitution of Adam as a sinner, if that makes sense. So Adam, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't want to go too far here because I know Deleuze will also get to Caesar crossing the Rubicon in later chapters. But right now, it does show that the world exists inside of the soul via that kind of perspective. But then the subject is also created for the world too. So is the world in the monad? Is the monad in the world? So both of those things can't be one, and like that can't work. The world can't be in the monad and the monad in the world for Deleuze. The world is in the monad, but the monad is for the world. That's what he's kind of saying here. Meyer, you write, you have an image. Yeah, please share. Please, you can unmute yourself or whatever you want.
Yeah, it's in my edition of the PDF, this thing here.
Interesting. That image is in your, or is that the? It looks
Yeah,
like
it's
we're using, I think, a different PDF. I'm using Daniel Smith's because everyone, I read the one that you read. That's why that image looks familiar to me.
mhm.
But I read that book, but then people recommend this one, so we're reading this one. But yeah, do you want to try and explain how this image is maybe like related to this, maybe, or you don't have
I
to?
can. I'll give it a shot. I'm not really sure, but I'll just explain what's coming to mind at least. Um, I guess one thing that's kind of striking is that uh, when we're talking about an infinite series, we're talking about like I don't know if this image would imply anything, or so we're talking about the type of infinity that a circle has. Uh, but what this is kind of reminding me of, in that the cyclical process that we're calling the world here, at a certain junction, it produces monads, and each monad having an infinity of perspectives, it kind of reminds me like the eternal return of difference. That it like for some reason this is giving me the vibe of like what returns is almost like the Kleineman, which is the always curvature of matter, basically. Producing something, a new perspective every time. That's kind of like what's coming to my mind, but I don't really know what's going on.
No, I think that's totally like I think that adding that eternal return of difference and talking about that is totally in the like, especially with Leibniz here, we're talking about continuity and we're talking about change and how change is constantly occurring. And you're totally right that
Mhm.
Deleuze is not sticking with a kind of fixed Cartesian subject. There's the subject is also always being reborn. So talking about that totally makes sense to me. What's interesting here, though, is Deleuze seems to me to be kind of using like the he's using the language of the typical idea that God creates the subject and kind of puts them they're created for the world, like for a purpose, right? To follow God's law, right? Like Deleuze is kind of he's using that traditional, religious vocabulary here. You know what I'm saying? So for Leibniz, we see that the monads have no windows. So how is it then possible that all monads can express the single same world? Um, how is that possible? What's holding that entire thing together? And so this is where we're going to get into the idea of possible worlds and compossibility here, where we're going to get to the idea that for Leibniz, this is Leibniz's argument. Deleuze is saying that God has to choose this world first. God comes first and says, this is the world. And then the monads express that. So it almost feels like deterministic, right? Like for everything to be in pre-established harmony, God has made it so that the monads will act that way. So they're made. It's God is choosing that world for the monad. That's what Leibniz sort of gets at here. Okay, so if the monad is created for expressing the particular world that God intended, then that can kind of solve a lot of these kind of problems that we were asking earlier about the role of the subject here. Because now we have God making that distinction between, the subject being for the world and their level of clarity and so on and so forth. And Leibniz is going to also replace like that kind of Christian God with the God of pre-established harmony, which is still choosing a possible world, right? That pre-established harmony is choosing the world that is the most harmonious. So that's why, that kind of Voltaire, he critiques Leibniz in this story. It's really funny, where Leibniz says that this is the best possible world. It's like, yes, slavery happened, the most atrocious things in society, the most tragic things, the Holocaust, etc. Leibniz would say that, yeah, those were needed because that is what God intends for the most harmonious world. That if those things didn't happen, the world would be far worse off. And Voltaire has like a funny story about how this guy struggles over and over and over again, and he's always like, "Oh, it's the best possible world, right?" So, but notice we're still choosing a world here, and that's where Deleuze is getting at. So he's gonna need to try and figure out this kind of issue of replacing a transcendent God with something more immanent. What does that look like? It seems like he's mainly asking questions here and hinting at that. One thing I kind of wanted to point out a little bit was his reading of Heidegger. I don't know if anyone's particularly Heideggerian here or they know a lot about the design. I don't. I've only read the question concerning technology. So, and only that like eponymous essay. I never read like the actual, like the entire book. But he's clearly critiquing the concept of the design about a being in the world, and that Leibniz is coming and instead is talking about a being for the world. So that reading of Heidegger to me is interesting, and I just don't know if anyone has any particular comments on that. Um, and then Meyer writes, Heidegger is an entirely forward landscape to me. Yeah, I think for a lot of people. So don't worry. Um, but everyone, thank you so much. I appreciate people joining. I know it's just like a lot of talking, but I think that this book is really weird. I think it's one of Deleuze's most interesting. And with these two chapters, we did get the folds of matter and the soul down. So we have those two chapters down. The next one, chapter 3, is what is Baroque. So hopefully Deleuze is going to start to get a little bit more between that relationship between the upper and lower floor, and hopefully he's going to talk more about the role of you know, the role of the subject here. So there we have it, and thanks everyone for joining, of course.
Thank you, Noel.
Yeah, thanks, Meyer. Seriously. Yeah, thanks, Bettina and Red. You said brace for the puns. Is that because lately I've been trying to write like weird server announcements, trying to be funny. Yeah. Woke and broke and baroque, right? Yeah, but thanks for showing up. And if anyone has any other about that one paragraph, feel free to theory chat me. I'm gonna theory chat in the next day or two about this paragraph, just because that subjectivity stuff is just so weird.
It is. I don't know how he's gonna, because like we could think of it in terms of like choosing a world in terms of like sampling a continuous signal with a discrete set. But then like how do we avoid the transcendence of what's doing the transcription from continuous to discrete, you know?
Bingo. I mean, I think you just hit the nail on the head. And I think that, and gosh, I know people dog on me for talking about Badiou so much, but like that's literally Badiou's criticism. It's that Deleuze is just replacing this with this operation or this differential field. But is that just not God all over again, right? And we'll see. I think Deleuze does answer it throughout, and we've also noticed some spots where I think Deleuze is kind of preparing for that critique. But yeah, Meyer, I think you're spot on there. So the next week we'll start chapter 3 and hopefully we can solve it. And I hope to see everyone there. But I have to run.
So yeah.
See ya.